This is where they were trying to figure out who the freak was Jesus.
Lock the doors. We need spears, torches, and lions.
It was sola scriptura.
That's true. They had the Bible.
After
Jesus
they took out half of it.
He gave.
Jesus said that upon this rock shall I build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
Oh, I've
Isn't that a
never
done
heard
deal?
that
Isn't it a done
before.
deal? Like,
Because the last thing Jesus did is he handed them a big book. And he's like, you don't need me anymore. Just worship this.
It became popular and grew because the church that owned it and the governments that owned it took over the world.
They posthumously excommunicated the early church fathers who didn't believe in these creeds.
Whoa, what? All of the scriptural references used in this episode will be brought to you by scripturenotes.com. For a free trial to Scripture Notes, please visit the link in the description. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Word Radio. I'm your host, Cardinellis. Today I'm joined in the studio by Jonah Barnes, Jacob Hansen, and Austin Falter. And we've got a compelling thesis here, a bold claim, if you will. The apostasy definitely happened, oftentimes in these online or over the airwaves disputes. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints get hammered for their belief in, quote, the great apostasy. Some people question if it actually happened, but one of them is not Jacob Hansen, who is bringing the receipts about the great apostasy and how it definitely happened. Jacob, what are you talking about? Go.
All right, so I think the way to start this is to just ask this question. Why does the God of Aristotle sound exactly like the God that emerged in the creedal tradition? Okay,
Oh, geez.
That's a little suspicious.
let's go through Aristotle's God and let's view if you recognize any of these things. Aristotle's God was an unmoved mover. He was pure actuality or being itself.
Oh gosh,
He
this
was-
sounds like the Athanasian Creed.
Yes, that's the point.
That's kind of the point. This God is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, without passions, without parts, without change. Now,
It literally says without passion and or parts.
yes, this is the Greek conception of God of the Greek philosophers. So,
And then they come out and say, no, it's not that he's without passion and or parts. It's he's without parts or passions.
yeah.
And
they just
Mormons
very
aren't
clever.
Christians. Mormons aren't Christians if they don't. Wow. Holy smoke.
So,
Okay.
so this is what's really interesting about this. Is this, if somebody just picked up the Bible today and started reading the stories of the Bible, would they say that, oh yeah, the God in this has no passions, no parts, he doesn't change at all, he doesn't react to the way humans are?
Emphatically no.
No.
Yeah.
No.
It's like, it's so obvious that the God of the Bible is not the God of Aristotle. Yet, the creedal tradition, that is the God that emerges in the creeds of, the Athanasian Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of Chalcedon. And people have to understand what was happening here, okay? What was happening was that the early church had a big problem on their hands. Actually, I'm going to go back even before the church. So here's the story. If you read the Old Testament and you go to the earliest books, in Genesis, for example, when he says the man has become like one of us.
Yeah.
So why is there multiple divine beings speaking in the creation story?
And speaking about apotheosis, they're speaking about they have become. If you said they have become like me, Christians would hate it already. But he says us. It's like a
Yes.
double whammy. It's like plurality
There's-
of creators and apotheosis all in one.
So you have this different conception of a pantheon of gods, but there's one God who is the most high God. This is, if you study the biblical scholarship, this is what ancient Israel's beliefs were. So how did it change? Well, one of the things that happens is, and you guys who study history, you'll know about this term Hellenization. This is when the Greeks and Greek philosophy began to spread throughout the ancient world, okay? And you can actually watch the tradition, the Old Testament tradition begins to get more monotheistic with time. And then eventually, by the time Jesus shows up, more or less, the Jewish intellectuals of the time had sort of embraced this hard, abstract monotheism, okay? And so the early Christians had a big problem on their hands. Because their conception of God that they had arrived at, mainly through the influence of Hellenization, was that God was this abstraction, this unmoved mover
Right.
that was immaterial.
A cloud in the ether. Yeah.
Yes. So you have a big problem. Jesus rises from the dead, and he's got a body.
Oh yeah, that don't jive with no parts or passions, or sorry, no passion or parts. Okay, yeah,
It's like a third grader who's like copying a paper but doesn't want their teacher to know, and they're like, I switched the phrase around so they won't know.
Wow. Okay, keep going.
So then the Christians now are faced with this problem, but there's another problem on top of this problem. See, early on in the very first century of the church, when the apostles were around, they had a central authority that could adjudicate questions of doctrine. For example, in the book of Acts, you have like the thing where Peter is like, we don't eat certain things because they're unclean, and then he changes that. Well, he was the one, and the apostles, they acted as this centralized governing body. Well, when they go away, you then have these theological questions, but you don't have a central authority that you can go to adjudicate the question. And so what arises is factionalism within the Christian movement. And by the way, anyone who studies Christian history will learn about what's known as the great Christological debates of the first centuries of the church. This is where they were trying to figure out who the freak was Jesus.
Trying to figure out or persecuting those that thought differently than them.
Okay,
It's like when the yard duty shows up at the bully that's beating up the kid and taking his lunch money. They're like, well, we're just figuring out who's paying for lunch. We're just figuring it out.
We're having a discussion. Do you mind?
It's like the people that make the videos about members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and saying like, after moving west, and it's like, okay, I don't know if
for some reason they
I don't know if that was a
west.
move or if it was escaping persecution. Okay, keep
it's like
going.
saying for some reason blacks in America, and
it's like
don't love the South. Go figure.
Exactly.
Now, Jacob, you can actually go back. So here's what I like to teach my kids. The word gospel means good news. So you have in the New Testament 4 gospels that are the good news, right?
All right.
So for 4 books, it's like, hey, this is great. And then after that, you have the bad news, which is they all die, they all get murdered, the kings all hang them and kill them, and then you have essentially all of the letters of Paul, which our Christian brothers and sisters love, is him saying, no, stop, you idiots, no, please, not that way, just writing letters to everybody, trying to pull them back from apostate doctrines and all the crumbling that you're talking about. There's no centralized authority. Paul's trying to stop all these false teachings from creeping in. I want to ask people who don't believe in the apostasy, I want to say, well, then why the letters of Paul at all? What was he trying to accomplish? He's trying to fight against false teachings that are coming into the church. So you have the good news, and then you have the bad news. And they wrote about this in the Bible. In Thessalonians and in 2 Peter, they say, there's already false teachers among us. There's already false prophets have arisen. One verse actually says, almost like they're shaking an evangelical. They're saying, let no man deceive you. There will be a falling away. It actually uses the word apostasy, right? There will be an apostasy. And yet still they somehow maintain that, everything's hunky-dory. Everything was fine.
Actually, that's
Paul
really
was
funny.
just writing love letters.
Whenever they try and talk to you and say like there is no apostasy, just be like, I'm sorry, I just believe in sola scriptura and the Bible says there was an apostasy, and so I just reject.
Well,
heresy.
here's what's wild. Okay, so this is something I've only realized recently. You have to understand that the authoritative interpretation of the Bible is inherently Greek. In other words, they start so William Lane Craig has this big thing like, you guys need to fix your perfect being theology, and it's like, no,
thank you.
No, that is literally the exact point. See, here's the difference. You have to ask people, what do you mean by God? And they say, that of which no greater can be conceived. That's Greek. The Greek notion was that God, they reasoned to this idea that God must be that of which no greater can be conceived. And then using philosophy, they basically came up with, where does that lead you? And it leads you to something that is immaterial, timeless, spaceless, all these things, because that is where the logic of great making properties, as they talk about in philosophy, leads you. So they have defined God as this, and then they go to the Bible and they say, how do we make this fit? Perfect being theology.
Yes, that's exactly what they did. Sometimes expressly. Sometimes they said, Augustine, like, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to make Christianity palatable to Greeks. I'm trying to infuse it with enough Hellenization that it will feel more comfortable to us Greeks.
Well,
like he said he was doing this.
And it's the whole idea is once you define God as X, you're not open to anything else. God must fit within these parameters of philosophy. And the Latter-day Saints, and I think what the original Christians should do, you throw that entire thing out and you just say, go to Jesus and say, Jesus, you rose from the dead. You tell me who God is.
Yeah.
And you read the Bible and you understand that. And what you find is it's not the abstract monotheistic creation of the Greek philosophers. And when you read the Bible through a Greek lens, that's what they do. And nowadays, if you cross that in any way, it's like, well, you're not a Christian. Why? Because the church had no central authority after the death of the apostles. There was a period there where...
You're wrong.
Well,
it was sola scriptura.
That's true. They had the Bible.
After
Jesus
they
gave
took out half of it.
He gave. That's the last thing Jesus did is he handed him a big book, and he's like, "You don't need me anymore. Just worship this."
Yeah, dude, for real.
So,
keep going.
And even those who claim that there was a central authority in the early church, there really wasn't. There was competing diverse factions within it. And so what happens is that Constantine takes on Christianity as the official religion of Rome. Okay? When he does, he's like, all right, guys, what do we believe?
Yes.
And it's like everyone's like fighting with each other. He goes, oh, crap. And so he gets the kind of the largest faction together, and they come up with, okay, we're going to set in stone what is orthodox and what isn't. We have to put a line in the sand and say, if you don't align with this, you are not a Christian. And what they come up with is the Nicene Creed, and then later the additional creeds clarify more things and make it bigger.
Clarify?
Yeah. They become, and what happens is, they standardize it. And so this creates the line between you are a Christian or you're not. Now, here's what's interesting. They never resolved the Christological debates of the first few centuries. What they did is they just imposed a creed of one group and said, this is the official interpretation. And not only are we going to impose it by social sort of thing, we're going to impose it via the state. And so for 1,500 years, the creed, which to this day no one defends as being reasonable and rational, the Trinitarian doctrine that came out of it is incoherent nonsense.
Bananas.
It's bananas. It's the attempt to take the round peg of Jesus, the embodied risen Lord, and square it with the square of Greek philosophical hard monotheism.
That's a great.
I like how you called it standardization. Like, I think I'm going to call up, I'm friends with the Embassy of Spain, of España, beautiful country that has been burdened, unfortunately, by a history of colonization and violent enforcement of its own dogmas upon the indigenous people. And I'm just going to say, you need to rebrand to standardization. We didn't colonize, we didn't colonize.
Great.
We settled doctrinal arguments through standardization. Here, indigenous pagan people that worship many gods, we're going to standardize this.
Please don't resist.
Like, okay.
Please comply with our
standards. This is great. Like, this is like what woke people do, and they're like stealing words all the time. They've stolen tolerance. They've stolen a million of other words. We just need to start stealing other words like standardize. Okay.
So actually, Jacob, I have a great example of this from the Ordo Romanus Primus. This is 1905. With Cuthbert and Atchley, if you want to go look this up, the London Press, page 16, where the Roman authorities, after this, what you're talking about, they standardize everything. They have their cage match. I love how they settle it like they're in a coliseum, right? They're like, the Caesar's like, we got to figure out how to settle this dispute. Like, well, how should we do that? And he's like, lock the doors. We need spears, torches, and lions. Yeah. Put them in the center, let them fight it out. And that's how Christianity was born from bare knuckle boxing, essentially. But when they come to the outer parts of the empire where people have been practicing Christianity for hundreds of years. The Roman authorities walk in and they go, hey, by the way, we're in charge now. And all these local communities that had been practicing Christianity on their own, they said, well, we were given our tradition by Andrew or by Bartholomew or by whomever. Ours comes down directly from Jesus Christ.
And they had uniquely, quote, Mormon, end quote, practices that had not been contaminated by the creeds yet.
Oh, you better believe
I had a
they
stake
did.
president that thought St. Nicholas in Turkey was the last one to actually hold the real
priesthood.
authentic priesthood. Yeah, pretty crazy.
I love that.
Okay, cool.
I don't want to check that because I
Yeah.
just like believing it.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Exactly.
Jonah, Jacob, Jesus said that upon this rock shall I build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
Oh,
Isn't
I've
that a
never
done
heard
deal?
that
Isn't it a done
before.
deal?
Right.
Like,
I've never heard that before. One of the interesting things about that verse, someone recently pointed this out, gates are defensive.
Right.
The gates of hell shall not prevail. In other words, the gates were keeping someone out.
Was
Yeah,
this,
you know what? The
this
guys
was-
that make that argument, I like. I didn't have to grow up in this town surrounded by the University of, it's not Catholics going after Mormons. It's a problem. You know what I said?
Yeah,
It's all the
yeah.
evangs, right?
That was Stephen Miller who did that, the independent researcher. Stephen Miller, he's the digital Danite. Yeah. He pointed that out, which is great. But to finish my point, the Ordo Romanus Primus records when the Roman authorities come and they find these guys practicing Christianity, they say, why are you doing it this way? Specifically, they're pointing to this tunic of immortality that they would wear as they were washed and anointed. Really weird.
Okay,
They say, why are you doing this? And they responded and said, we don't know. This is just what Jesus told us to do to remember him. And the writing in the Ordo Romanus Primus is that he says they have substituted, they're following custom rather than reason. Isn't that telling?
Yeah.
They're following this custom rather than reason. I imagine these guys talking to Jesus. He's like, always do this in remembrance of me. This wine is my blood. This bread is my flesh. And some evangelical standing there and be like, excuse me. This is custom, not reason, right? Like they turned into their enemies. They became the state enemy that placed reason above the basic things. Jesus just said, do this.
See,
Just
I
do
think
this.
it sounded like all of the self-congratulatory Gen Xer atheists that write one book or read one book on, like by Christopher Hitchens or Dawkins, and all of a sudden think that they're the smartest guys in the room.
Right.
Okay.
So it's interesting because with these creeds, you create an orthodoxy that wasn't earned through like convincing people. You create an orthodoxy that's imposed upon people by the state. And that is for 15. Here's one of the things that's interesting. The Christian conception of God as this Trinity that no one can understand didn't become popular because so many people were convinced by it. It became
That's a good point.
It became popular and grew because the church that owned it and the governments that owned it took over the world. And so what happens is that this version of Christianity, for which, by the way, is wonderful and has so many good things, like the creedal tradition, I believe, is of the ancient sort of fragments, was the biggest and best one, but it still was broken fundamentally, and it was enforced and pressed upon the world for 1,500 years until there was this new nation that said, we're not going to enforce creeds through the state.
Through the state.
The United States. And do you see where all of a sudden it's like, there's a chance that there's a chance for something new to happen that breaks the creedal tradition?
This episode is sponsored by Rod Meldrum and the Constitution Party.
Right now he's listening and he's like,
Yeah, Jacob. To join the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Movement, please go to
here's the thing, though.
libertarian.org.
The creeds are still enforced today. They're not argued with. Remember, when people talk, when we challenge the doctrine of the Trinity, they don't go and say, well, but the Trinity makes perfect sense. That is not the argument. The argument is simply to look at you and say, you reject the Trinity? Well, then you're not a Christian.
by fiat.
You're not part of the official club that was imposed on the world for the past 1,500 years by force. We don't have to convince you.
Yeah.
We just will socially shame you for you're not a Christian.
Dude,
do you want to be that?
What's even crazier?
It's just coercion.
What's
it's not
crazier?
argument.
They posthumously excommunicated the early church fathers who didn't believe in these creeds.
Whoa, what?
Did you know this? Anybody can Google it. Go Google Oregon. Oregon excommunication. Go Google it.
Wait, do you mean the one that we usually say origin?
Origin, Oregon. I don't know.
Okay,
Origin. I haven't knows. I don't know. I'm not.
Okay.
But go look the dude up. He was posthumously excommunicated.
That's a little sketchy.
Because he didn't agree with the creeds. So they kicked him out. It's like this dude was practicing Christianity 400 years before any of y'all. Like he's that much closer. He was, 70% closer to Jesus than you are. And they're here saying, he's not a true Christian. And now they're doing this to us.
And
it's
so
crazy.
You have, to put kind of wrap this up in a little bow, you have two major things that happened. The first, the centralized authority is lost, and then the true nature of God is perverted. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that wonderful, great things don't happen within the creedal tradition. I believe that it takes people closer to Christ, definitely does. But if you think that the creedal tradition and the Trinitarian formulation is like, yeah, that's obviously what the Bible teaches, is this immaterial, passionless, partless thing, like you're just like, no, you don't believe that because it makes sense. You believe that because it's the tradition that you've been given, and it's the popular thing to do, and has been for the past, I don't know,
How many centuries?
1700 years.
Yeah, right. It's true.
Wow.
They lost central authority, and Caesar came in and said,
here's my great God, make it work.
Right.
This is dangerous stuff, though, Jacob, because if it is true, you are stripping most anti-Mormon, especially Protestant and evangelical apologists, of their number one weapon against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, against Joseph Smith, against, quote, Mormons, end quotes. End quote. Just this up-nose adage of, well, they're not real Christians.
And that's why I look right at the camera, right at them, and I say, better to be a heretic than to be wrong.
Oh, boom, shakalaka. Okay. Unfortunately, we have to pay some bills and take a brief commercial break here. We're going to come back on the other side of this break with just another hot topic. That's what we do here in the Ward Radio Wigwam. If you guys want to hear more about the apostasy being a faux show thing, make sure you guys check us out on wardradio.com and check out some of the bonus materials that we're going to be throwing up there. As always, for this and more, please check us out at wardradio.com.